Well, hello, New Life Church. So glad to have you be joining us today for our message this week. I am not going to surprise you with by informing you that I am a Minnesota Vikings fan. I think that's been pretty clear. I do watch most of the games. I follow the news about their draft picks, the trades, the injuries, the wins, the losses. I gripe with my son Andrew about coaching decisions. I have gone to a couple of games over the years, although Price usually doesn't allow me to get a lot of tickets. I've gone to their training camp. I own a couple of Minnesota Vikings caps, some shirts, and have had a jersey or two during my lifetime. And of course, the most important aspect of being a Vikings fan is that I despise the Green Bay Packers as much as is Christianly allowable by God. It helps that I'm reasonably confident that God isn't a Packers fan either. I call myself a fan, but in comparison with others, there are some out there who would have to be called or characterized by the phrase Viking fanatics. They are all in, especially on game day. They tailgate outside the stadium starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, driving in their purple Vikings decorated conversion vans. I have seen some of them. They're absolutely amazing. They, of course, have season tickets. They wear jerseys and purple shoulder spikes, and they have helmets on them that have the Vikings horns going up. They paint their faces. They wear purple and gold beaded necklaces. They go shirtless sometimes and paint their chests. They know the words to the Skol song, and on it goes. They are not casual fans. They are not casual followers, casual believers. They live and breathe Vikings football. And the question hit me this week, how would a Vikings fanatic coach a casual Vikings fan like me to become a fanatic like them? Well, among other things, it would include significant steps towards an all-in mentality with our NFL football team. It would change how the person thinks, how the person appears, how they act, how they spend their money, how they schedule their weekends, how they talk, how they surf the internet and watch television, and even how they decorate their homes or their offices. And then the question hit me, what would it take for a person to migrate from being a casual follower or a casual believer of Jesus to being an all-in disciple? For several weeks this summer, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. Steps that move us from being believers to being disciples. Not that we would start calling ourselves disciples instead of believers. Culturally, I don't think that gains us a whole lot. But just like the Vikings owners could wish that every resident in our entire state of about 6 million people, their Vikings owners would hope that we would all be all-in Vikings fanatics. I have to believe that God's desire is that every person in every church becomes an all-in disciple of Jesus Christ. So let's look at this. Let's try to look at this with a mindset that says, I probably can take more steps away from being a casual believer to being a significant all-in disciple of Jesus Christ. So one of the first things I'd like to clarify is simply this. What do I mean by the term believer, and what do I mean by the term disciple? So a believer, or maybe it might be more accurate to say a casual believer, might be a term that you'd prefer, might be described as someone who gives intellectual assent to the truths of the gospel and may occasionally feel close to God, but Jesus really is not much more than a handy and welcome add-on to this person's present life. A disciple, though, is someone who was so moved by the truth of Christ's sacrifice for them that everything in their lives revolves around Jesus Christ. He literally has changed how that person thinks, how that person acts, how that person talks and spends their money and decorates their houses, how they schedule their week, how they surf the internet, what they watch on TV, how they listen to the radio. It is an all-encompassing alignment with all things Jesus. Now, I want to be careful here, okay? Because there are some vocal followers of Jesus who appear to be all-in disciples when I think many times they are pretty misguided. And there are some deeply committed disciples who are more quiet, but whose lives reflect Jesus in powerful and beautiful and very deep ways. This is about more than just external appearances. Someone that Nancy and I know quite well who lives in another state posts some spot-on sayings and quotations on his Facebook site. Online, he appears committed and perhaps even mature, but we know him well enough to know that his internal life is perhaps best characterized as being a spiritual toxic dump. So the first step that we'll look at that moves us from being believers to being disciples is this: am I passionately committed to Jesus Christ? How would you answer this question? Am I just a believer in Jesus who does the church thing every now and then as long as nothing else comes up? Or am I passionately pursuing what it means to be a fully committed disciple of Jesus? It's a difficult question for us to answer about ourselves because we can be experts at self-deception. I know I can be. So maybe a different perspective would help. How would Jesus answer that question about you? Are we people characterized by doing the church thing every now and then, or by being a fully committed disciple of Jesus? So there's a story from the Gospel of John where Jesus made some statements to those who were listening, and the effect was that it separated out those who kind of liked the Jesus thing, kind of liked the church thing, from those who ended up being committed to him on an all-in basis. So let me give you a little bit of the setting, okay? Jesus is partway through his ministry years, and we read in John chapter 6, in verse 2, where it tells us this: a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. So lots of sick people finding healing, okay? And right after this is the beginning actually of the story where he feeds the crowd of 5,000 men, which included certainly thousands of women and children as well. All right? His ministry is well on its way at this point in time to looking like a mega church. All right? Can you imagine 20,000 people responding positively to what he was doing, and responding positively to the things that he was teaching them and the miracles that were happening, and then a free meal for 20,000 people that just kind of like appears out of virtually nothing. Imagine the attraction of a faith healer where everyone is legitimately getting healed and nobody's saying it's a hoax. Now the disciples are people just like us. So that evening, we're told that they get in the boats and they head across the Sea of Galilee without Jesus. And imagine the conversation in the boat as it's now become evening and dusk and then later than that. And they're talking among themselves and they're saying, wasn't that amazing? When the word gets out about this, we won't be feeding 20,000 people. We're going to be feeding 50,000 people. And in the midst of crossing the Sea of Galilee, this is the story where Jesus catches up to them walking in the water, and where Peter jumps out of the boat and walks on the water for a few moments as well. All right? And when they see that, they change their saying. They say, when the people find out about this, we won't be feeding 50,000 people. We'll be feeding 100,000 people. And so they land in Capernaum, which was a little village on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd catches up to them, and he begins to teach them. And among the things that Jesus teaches them is this. We get down in chapter 6, starting at verse 53, where Jesus says this: whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Obviously, we know that he is speaking figuratively here, speaking symbolically, but can we be honest about this? Eating my flesh? Drinking my blood? This sounds crazy. And I could imagine, we're not told this, I could imagine the disciples are starting to question, maybe even starting to panic like Trump's aides would do, or President Biden's aides would do when they go off script at a speech or interview and they're going, what's he saying? Wrong message. What is Jesus doing? He's ruining everything. Well, here's what he's doing, and Jesus did nothing that was not intentional. He is drawing a line between casual followers and all-in disciples. He's essentially communicating to them the bigger picture of, here's what this looks like, people. Are you with me or not? And then we come to the end of that chapter, or the end of John chapter 6, and in the last 12 verses of this chapter, this week and then next week, I want us to be looking at least 4 key words, perhaps more than that. We're just going to look at 2 of them today that jumped out at me as I was studying this passage, that helped define and clarify the difference between a casual believer and an all-in disciple. So let's take a look, starting at verse 60 of John chapter 6. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And Jesus, aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, does this offend you? Is this unacceptable to you? Do you think this is impossible for you to do? So the first of these words that we're going to be looking at is this word offend, where Jesus says, does this offend you? Most versions of the Bible don't use the word offend. They use the word grumbling or murmuring. All right? Mere believers get offended by the hard teachings and the serious expectations of Jesus. Committed disciples, however, choose to embrace Jesus both for the great blessings like an amazing meal and the healings, as well as embracing Jesus for the difficult teachings, the difficult self-examination, the difficult pruning that he needs to do in our sin-filled hearts. So that word offend, it actually comes from the Greek word scandalize, which we get the word scandal or scandalized from it. It literally means to put up an obstacle, to put up an impediment in the way in order to make someone stumble or fall or take a bad step. Jesus is saying this, you call yourselves disciples, well, this is what it means to be a disciple. And then he follows that up and practical expectations come out. For example, like teaching them how we should be extravagantly generous to people who are in need, people who are poor. But like so many people today, these men and women of Jesus' day, the crowds that were there, they all had their preconceived notions of what it should mean to follow Jesus and what it should mean to be generous with my money toward people in need. So when Jesus says something that's contrary to it, they don't bend. They don't follow. They make that be an obstacle to following him fully. They actively choose that they will not obey this. Rather than conform, they choose to be scandalized, they choose to be offended, they choose to grumble and murmur about it. They choose to say in their hearts, no way, I will not conform my life to that. I'm going to let that be an obstacle. I'm not going to obey that. As I look at my faith journey, I'd have to say that the 2 areas where this is the most difficult for me are in either asking for forgiveness or extending forgiveness to others. In my first year here in Aiken, about 9 years ago now, God convicted my heart one week so strongly about how I had spoken inappropriately about co-workers from a different chapter of my ministry. I was getting ready during the week to preach a message from the book of Ruth, and early in the week, God made it so clear to me that I must not preach that message without resolving my choice to sin that had hurt others and how I had harbored my right to do what I had done, harbored that in my heart. My heart was a battleground all week long. Pride tried to maintain this enormous obstacle within my spirit, and here's what I found. Satan works overtime to make it easy for us to justify our most debilitating sins. But God, I responded that week, they were in the wrong. Others in leadership came to the conclusion that they were in the wrong. They assured me that I had chosen the right course of action in the big picture of things. But His Spirit impressed on me, but you know that you maligned their character. You damaged them. And this needs to be made right. Well, it was impossible for me to connect with them in person, and so the path that I chose was to write several emails to a variety of different people that were either directly involved in this or indirectly involved in this, that knew about what had happened. And I wrote these emails, first asking forgiveness from those that I had directly hurt. I wrote an email confessing my sin to other colleagues and friends that I had spoken inappropriately to about other individuals. I wrote emails to apologize to leaders whose lives I had made more difficult by exacerbating the problem instead of helping resolve it. I even asked my coworkers to extend an apology to their children who suffered some of the fallout of my actions way back. It was so painful and especially humiliating to do so, but the moment I pressed send on my computer to send out those emails, my heart was set free. Totally committed meant, for me in that moment, it meant humbly asking forgiveness rather than allowing an obstacle to keep me from taking that step of obedience. It was so hard to do, but so releasing when I did it. I just simply couldn't continue in casually believing that we're supposed to forgive others when I knew that God wanted me to step into humbling confession, casually believing that I needed to ask forgiveness. Excuse me, all right? Jesus says, does this offend you? Is this an obstacle for you to obey? Fully committed disciples strengthen their spines and say, no, Jesus, I'm willing to do even that. And then Jesus' interaction continues in the next verses, where we see the second word that we're going to focus on today, and then we'll wrap this up, all right? So verse 62, what if you see, Jesus continues to say, what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where He was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray Him. The second word that helps define who was just a casual believer versus who was a fully committed disciple is actually the word believe. All right? The word is more than just an intellectual assent. Remember what James wrote in James chapter 2, verse 19. He says to his readers, he says, you believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that, and they shudder. So what James is saying is, hey, don't fool yourself into thinking that it's sufficient to mentally agree that God exists. Demons believe God exists. They don't have faith. That's not what that word believe means, to just have this intellectual agreement about something. It goes beyond that. It's faith followed by actions. It's belief that gets lived out, that what God is looking for in our lives. The word that James and Jesus use for believe means to actively trust because of something you embrace as being true. So Jesus, now back to John chapter 6, Jesus is saying that there are some in the crowd, and we'll eventually see that it is in reality the majority of the crowd who casually agree, who casually believe that what Jesus says is true, but they will change absolutely nothing in their lives. That sounds pretty close to what we see in virtually every church today. Many people who believe the right statements, but they have very little bearing in how they live their lives. It reminds me of the story, and many of you have probably heard this, of the tightrope walker who walked over and back over Niagara Falls maybe about 100 years or so ago, and when he got back to where he had started out, the crowd was cheering his skills and his bravery and all, and then And then after they quieted down, he asked them a question. He said, I got a wheelbarrow right here. How many of you believe that I could put somebody in the wheelbarrow and walk safely over and back? And probably, I think virtually everybody in the crowd, raised their hand. Yeah, I believe you can do that. And then he asked, who wants to volunteer? And all the hands went down. Why not? Why did the hands go down? Well, they really did believe he could do it, but not enough to put their life on the line. This is the difference between saying, I believe it, but I won't actually do anything about it, versus I believe it, and I'm going to change my life as a result of it. When something happens in my life where it seems like the wheels have fallen off, when there's something that is very, very troubling to me, something that's challenging, something that is worrisome, I can declare God's promises like the best of you. All things work together for the good of those who love God. I can remind myself, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. But later in the day, when I lay in bed and I allow worry and anxiety to control my thoughts, it's pretty clear that I don't believe it, truly believe it, as much as it might sound like I truly believe it. So I'll be honest with you today. I know this, worry and anxiety are among the most frequent areas where I need to take steps of faith. I have not mastered my thought life in the areas of confidence in God and worry and anxiety the way that I wish I could. I definitely need in this particular area to move on from the quality of a casual believer to that of a fully committed disciple. I imagined this week what it would be like if I had been alive in Jesus' day, if I had been one of those disciples, if I had walked with Jesus, if I spent day in and day out with him, sleeping 15 feet from him on a hard floor somewhere, with just a blanket over me and knowing that he is right there and he's taking care of all my needs. I know if I walked that closely with Jesus right now, I would keep worry and anxiety way further away from my heart than sometimes they are. So I ask you, what area of belief is the one where you are most prone to live like a casual believer? You know the right things. Doesn't affect how you live. We're going to return to this story next week. And we're going to consider further what Jesus said and did that made it so clear to everyone who was a casual believer and to everyone who was willing to say, I'm in, Jesus. I'm willing to embrace anything you expect of me, even when it seems outrageous. Because, after all, you look at the example of Jesus. Dying on a cross is something pretty outrageous that he was willing to do for you. He's telling the crowds, symbolically, eat my flesh, drink my blood, and they're going, that's outrageous. Well, there had come a time not too far before that where the Father had said, you say you love those people down there, but here's what it's actually going to look like. You're going to go down there, you're going to live among them, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be beaten, you are going to be tortured, you are going to be crucified. Do you love them that much, or do you just say you love them that much? And Jesus showed that he truly does love us that much, that he truly does believe and live out what he believes. May we follow his example far better in the weeks to come than we have in the past. Would you bow with me for a word of prayer? Forgive us, God. I think sometimes in the church we have made the expectations be just so low. Hey, say this prayer, believe these things, and that's enough. That stamps your ticket to heaven. And as a result of that, God, our lives sometimes can be far more characterized by someone who is a casual believer, a casual fan, as it were, rather than an all-in, fully committed, true disciple of Jesus Christ. I know I need to grow in this area. My belief is that probably each person watching this video today and listening needs to grow in that area as well. So this summer, Lord God, would you help each of us to take further steps of living out our faith, living out what we say we believe, so you would be honored, so that the world would notice, so that people would be drawn to Jesus like we have been drawn to Jesus. And it's in his name that I pray these things. Amen. I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless each of you.